Welcome to Unit 1, Lecture 4. So this is going to be about population ecology, and this is part 1. This is going to be broken down into 2 different lectures, just because otherwise it'll get pretty long if I try and cram it all into one. So we're going to talk in the next couple of lectures about populations, what happens to populations, population interactions, and human populations. Okay. Population, if you remember, is a group of individuals of the same species in the same area. So we're talking about the humans in I-105, the deer in Washington Township, that kind of stuff. Population ecology is the studying of changes in the populations over time and what's actually affecting those populations. So this is interactions between populations, this is interactions between individuals in populations. Remember, we talked about interspecific interactions and intraspecific interactions, competition, predator-prey, all of that kind of stuff comes into play. And so population ecology is a way to try and understand how these things are all interacting with each other, to understand what they're doing to each other. Are they causing the populations to grow, shrink? Are they expanding their range? Are they narrowing their range? And so it's a huge area and a huge topic because we're looking at abiotic factors, biotic factors, and levels of how they all come together to affect a population. So we're going to try and boil it down and keep it a little bit simple, but it's just a big thing. Okay, and it's really important when it comes to conservation when you're talking about trying to actually conserve a population, because if you don't know what's affecting the population, how can you know how to help it? And so that's where this all comes into play. So one of the big characteristics of a population is called population density. So that just basically means how many individuals are in an area and how are they organized, or if they're not organized. There are 3 methods. We've got clumped, uniform, and random. So if you look at this, okay, we've got clumped. So you can see there's a pocket here, there's a pocket here, and so, but then there's a lot of empty space in that area. So if we were to say this was a square mile, okay, we've got some over here and we've got some over here. Then we've got uniform. Okay, so uniform is basically what you would expect it to be. They're just kind of dispersed uniformly across the area. And then random, very few things if we think about nature we could look at are random, but when we think about populations, that just means that there's really no necessarily a good way to describe how they're dispersed. All right, and so you can see here is you got all these little dots all over the place. So they're not clumped in the sense that you've got a lot over here and a lot over here, and they're not quite uniform because they're not equally spaced from each other. Because maybe in the case of some of these guys, maybe this is this close pair right here, maybe they're a breeding pair. All right, maybe they're related to each other, or they're, like I said, a breeding pair, or maybe like this little bit over here, maybe that's a nest. All right, or in this case, you see the patches of green. Okay, so it depends. The other thing that scientists use to kind of study populations are called life tables. And life tables just kind of look at survivorship and life expectancy and try and get a sense of who's going to survive and who's going to live, who's going to reproduce, and so on and so forth. So survivorship tends to follow one of 3 patterns. So we've got a type 1, which is us. So if you can see looking at this graph over here, all right, you can see this graph where we have number of basically individuals, so who survives, okay, over their lifespan. So for humans, we are a type 1 curve, which means for the most part, as a species across the planet, we survive until we hit about, let's say, 75. Okay, so we're living, we're doing our thing, and then at about 75, that's where survivorship for the species starts to tail off. Okay, and that's where less and less individuals are surviving into these ages. So if we say this would be 75 up to 100, less and less people are surviving. But from 0 birth to 75, pretty straightforward, pretty standard, pretty stable. All right, we do get some dipping here after 50, but it really, our life. So this is where we think about our life expectancy. If we were to, currently the U.S. life expectancy is somewhere around 70 or 72, somewhere around there. So it's expected that you'll survive until you're 72. As our normal, what's expected, our life expectancy. These guys are also tend to be called K-selected species. So what that means is they have few young, and a lot of times because of that fewer number of young, the parents actually give more care to the young. So you, depending on how many siblings you may or may not have, okay, your parents can give you care. If you had 20 siblings, okay, they wouldn't necessarily be able to give you the same amount of attention and the same amount of care that they would give you if you had 20 siblings as if you had 2 or none, okay? And so K-selected species tend to have fewer young, and most of the time those young survive to maturity, and they hover around as a species with, remember, that carrying capacity. They don't have a lot of dramatic swings in population species or in population numbers, okay, because of this survival. All right, they're able to survive to such an older age. We've got the type 2 survivorship curve, which is kind of in the middle. The type 2 survivorship curve is this guy right here with the squirrels. All right, if you notice, it's a straight line. So basically, your chance to survive at any age is about the same. They tend to have an intermediate number of young, think 4 or 5, maybe up to 10. Okay, so they probably give them some care, but not as much as you would get from a parent. Okay, and so they basically it's a good chance that they'll survive. It's about a 50-50 swing. Okay, then we've got these type 3 guys right here. Type 3 guys, fishes, invertebrates, those kinds of, usually, especially like a lot of external fertilization. Because what there is with external fertilization is there's a lot of young, okay, there's no care. If you think about fish, okay, or oysters, like they have a picture here of an oyster. They release the eggs and sperm into the water. They meet up. All right, there's no real care there. Okay, so like I said, a lot of times when you think about it, external fertilization falls into this category because it fertilizes out in the water, and then they fall wherever they may. So with type 3, you end up having this really steep drop off at a certain age. Okay, and so this is actually percentage of lifespan, but hey, humans can live to 100, so that's okay. So you have this huge drop off of the young getting eaten, not finding suitable habitat, not finding nutrition. All right, and then once they reach this certain point, that if they've crossed this threshold, so in this case we're looking at 25, about 25%, then there's a good chance that they'll continue to survive. Okay, until whatever their natural lifespan is. So you end up getting lots of young with very low survivorship, but the adults that survive are actually very well, the best at surviving. That sounded weird. Okay, the best adapted. So those are known as R-selected species. Okay, so they have lots of young. They generally go up and down depending on a lot of conditions, because in certain cases, the more young can survive in better years that have more grass, more plankton in the water, that kind of stuff. Whereas in worse years, when there's less grass, less plankton, less this, less that, not as much young would survive. So they tend to be subjected a lot to swings in the environment. Okay. Once again, talking back with carrying capacity, populations generally can experience 2 kinds of growth. The exponential growth, which is where they just grow and grow and grow, okay, and then depending on what limits them, and then logistic growth, which is where they grow and then they taper off near that carrying capacity. So you remember that carrying capacity, K. Okay. And so so that's part of a way to describe population growth. And whether a population is growing exponentially or logistically can influence what kind of species it is, what kind of conservation pattern, what kind of factors are affecting it. So in the case of exponential growth, a lot of times you'll see a lot of those as your R-selected species because they'll grow and then crash, grow and then crash, grow and crash, depending on the environment that is currently trying to support them. Whereas a K-selected species, K carrying capacity, tends to hover near that carrying capacity. There might be a little up and down here, depending, because some years the environment is better, perfect weather as opposed to droughts or blizzards, fires, that kind of stuff. All right, and so what happens is they actually hover around this carrying capacity. There are two types of factors. So a limiting factor is anything that can limit that carrying capacity. They can be density dependent, so they rely on the predators, or they rely on the population density, or density independent, where they don't rely on the population density. So population density is very important, okay? And then in density independent, it's whatever. So density dependent, predators, disease, food, availability, competition, so on and so forth. Density independent, weather conditions, floods, fires, earthquakes, volcanoes, blizzards, that kind of stuff. So it would affect the population no matter how many there were. So it depends. Okay. All right, so here's our wrap up. So here is a population graph of two different populations. So they go by generation. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the blue line, which is this guy right here, is the wolf population. And then the red line is the moose population. All right. So looking at this population graph, is there any evidence of exponential growth? Is there any evidence of logistic growth? Do you think these two species have different carrying capacities? Hypothesize the relationship between these two organisms. So we were talking about types of species relationships in a couple lectures ago. So what is the relationship between these two organisms? And take a look at the different y-axes. So the one for the wolves and the one for the moose. All right. See what's the difference there, and does that impact your interpretation of this graph? So make sure to post this on Blackboard, and I will see you in class.